Hey everyone, how's it going? Happy Thursday. So really quickly, before we get into it, can everyone just let me know in the chat, can you see me okay? Can you hear me okay? You know, the standard thing. I'm here by myself, so I'm kind of producing as well as doing the content for you. So yeah, just let me know. Perfect, cool. Hey John, how's it going? Hey to Demented Ferret, I like that. And Cyril, Eduardo. Thanks for joining live, and thanks to everyone else who's here and to anyone who is watching the recording on the Maxon Trainer Team YouTube channel. I appreciate it. So if you're new, my name's Elly. I am a trainer here at Maxon, and I specialize in training Cinema 4D and Redshift. And today, if you can't tell by the kind of giant Photoshop text, we're looking at faster Redshift renders. And we're going to cover some optimization tips and tricks inside of Redshift. And the aim here is really to speed up our render times, but also not really impact the quality of the render. So that's always a conversation that I have when I talk about Redshift rendering. It's sort of that balance between time and quality. So we're going to see what we can do here. And the main thing here, or one of the main things, is this is compatible whatever DCC you're using. So as far as I'm aware, the render settings for Redshift are pretty compatible across the board. So whether it's C4D, Houdini, Maya, all of these tips and tricks, when it comes to optimizing render settings, are all transferable. So one other quick disclaimer before we get into it. Most of the time I do project breakdowns. So we create an entire project from scratch inside of Cinema 4D and Redshift. This is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be more of a technical optimization guide. So we're going to look at tips and tricks. We're going to be diving into those render settings, and it is going to be more of a technical style tutorial. But hopefully you will come away in the next, 45 minutes to an hour with the knowledge of what the render settings do, and then also how you can then look at your scene and look at your render and go, okay, this is what I need to do to make it look better, and then to also speed up that render time. So hopefully that's the information you're going to come away with today. As always, also hey to everyone who's joining in the chat. Hey to Metabeat, Dean, Dances for Peas, Sharon. How's it going, everyone? Cool. So if you have any questions for me, then I'll be monitoring the chat as well. If you could just do me a favor and put like a capital question at the front of it, that just helps me out when I'm then skimming back through if I can get to any of those questions. Cool. So let's have a little look at the things that can impact our render times before we get into the software. So some of the main things that can impact our render times are hardware, so the computer or the laptop that we're on, scene optimization, and this is the stuff inside of your DCC of choice that could impact render times, like simulations or high subdivisions, and then also that all-important final one, which is render optimization. So we're going to talk about the first two just really quickly now, and then we're going to be really diving into the render settings in about 5 minutes. So a little bit about hardware. And just to clarify, I am by no means a hardware tech expert. I know about software, I know about Cinema 4D, and I know about Redshift. When it comes to hardware, I am not very knowledgeable. But the things that matter when it comes to rendering inside of Redshift is your GPU. So specifically here, we're talking about the GPU version of Redshift. We're not talking about the CPU one. So as it is a GPU accelerated render engine, as you can imagine, the more powerful the GPU or the more graphics cards that you have, the better performing Redshift will be. And the same for the amount of RAM or unified memory that you have. These two things work very well together in improving performance and speeds in Redshift. So I've put some recommended requirements here, and these can actually be found on the website. So let me just link you to these. Let me just drop this in the chat. So these are the recommended requirements. So you can find these under the support section of the website. And it also shows minimum requirements and the graphics cards that are suitable for Redshift. I personally am on a M3 Max MacBook Pro with 128 gig of unified memory. I have different reasons for wanting to use a Mac. Portability is a big one. I like to be able to have a laptop. I got my Sense Labs pen tablet. I can pack it all in a rucksack. Then I can go to events, studios, and it's nice and portable. But use whatever hardware you have access to and that you like to use. I'm not here to tell you what to use. I'm just here to tell you what makes a difference. But sometimes we might not be able to upgrade our hardware, or we might not be able to change this. So what are the things that we can actually begin to change that will affect our render speeds? And this is where we can look at scene optimization. And this is going to be DCC specific. So some of this is just some of the things inside of Cinema 4D that will have an effect on performance and render time. The first of which, if like me, you like working with simulations and dynamics, cache and bake those sims. I promise you that will make a massive difference to performance and times. Avoid things like high subdivisions. So if you have high polygon counts, try and use Redshift tessellation instead. So that can be found in the Redshift object tag. Also, avoid things like high object counts. If you can, use instancing and use proxies. And also avoid high resolution textures. So if you're working with 8K textures and you perhaps don't need them and don't need that much detail, then maybe try and pull those down and you'll find a big difference. Another thing is remove unused objects and materials. And this might sound like a little bit of a strange thing to say, but I specifically have a little bit of a different workflow when it comes to creating procedural materials. I like to build a lot from scratch. And sometimes once I'm happy with a material, but still want to make some changes, I'll copy it, paste it, and then I work on that new instance. And then I do that again and again and again. And so I have about 5 or 6 different versions of a texture. I then use the one that I'm happy with, and then I delete the rest. So doing things like that will make a difference. And then finally, displacement. Instead of doing it on the geometry or on the mesh itself, try and use the Redshift displacement in the material and in your object tag. And then finally, some extra little things that kind of are rendering related, but that we're not going to be talking about are things like motion blur, depth of field, volumetrics, caustics, transmission, refraction, and SSS are what we call expensive when it comes to render times. Those things will just increase your render time, unfortunately, and it is what it is. So if you can even take some of these into consideration, it's going to help optimize your scene and again, optimize your render times. But again, similar to hardware, you might not be able to do these things. You might be completely set with a scene or be sent how it is, and you might not be able to make these changes. This is where we can then go into our render optimization settings, because this is able to be done on any scene in any DCC with Redshift. And so what we're going to talk about today are 3 or 4 main things, and that is the optimization workflow, where we're going to be looking at sampling, in particular unified sampling, so manual sampling, which is things like your min and max samples that can be fired, and your adaptive error threshold, which is the sensitivity of how aggressively it goes from min to max samples. We're going to look at local sampling. These are the overrides for your lights and materials, your reflections, your brute force rays. And then we're going to dive into global illumination. So it's a big topic that a lot of people talk about, brute force versus IPC. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to talk about trace depths, which are the different ray bounces for our different ray types, like our reflection and our refraction, volumes and transparency. And then we're also going to touch a little bit on hardware ray tracing, which is sort of in amongst trace depths and globals. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about bucket size. And again, the kind of overall goal here, really quickly, if you've sort of joined a little bit later, is to achieve faster render times without impacting our render quality. So hopefully over the next kind of like 30 to 45 minutes, you feel confident and comfortable when it comes to adjusting these render settings that can begin to optimize your scene and speed up those render times. And so this is the scene that we're going to be working on. This is just an interior scene here that we can see sort of rendered in 7 minutes 40, and then we can get a very similar equivalent result in 1 minute 13 by looking at these render settings. You can actually download this as well. So really quickly, just before we kind of move on, if you head over to my Instagram, which is just at itwaselly, I have a Linktree link. And if you just click that, you can access my project files. So we click that. And then you can download this. I think it's in one of the 2023 ones. You can download and access that. Okay, so let's get into how we can then look at optimizing this. So this is the scene we're going to be looking at, just this interior scene here. Let me just open up our render settings, and I'm going to start from a brand new set of render settings. The only thing I do want to match is the output, which is 1024 by 1280. So let me just get a new set of render settings. 1024 by 1280. And the reason I'm doing this sizing is because I want to do everything live, which might come with its problems, but I think it will be more helpful to be doing these renders live in front of you on this live stream while I'm changing the things, just so you really believe what they're doing. So we're going to leave that as that, and then we don't need to worry about saving anything. But what we do want to do is we're going to come down to Redshift. And so we're now going to be spending the rest of the time really just inside of the render settings and with my picture viewer open, having a look at that. So let me just make sure we haven't got any questions. Again, if you do, just add a little question at the start of it and I can take a look through those. So just in case we have some people here that are maybe new to Redshift, I do want to talk a little bit about the basic mode versus the advanced mode. So when we have our renderer set to Redshift and we click on Redshift, we have these two different modes. Basic mode, what that gives us is it gives us all of the common parameters when it comes to rendering. And the thing is, if you are new or you're a beginner in Redshift, then that is a great place to start and it's a great place to work. It is automatic sampling, and all we need to do is we adjust the bucket quality. And this is the quality of your render. There are preset values that change the error threshold. Again, that's something we'll talk about it more in detail in a little bit. But really, we can just say we want a low resolution render, medium resolution render, high, etc. And that's what it's going to do. As you can imagine, the higher the quality, the longer the render time. That's sort of how it works when it comes to working with this method. We then have denoising and motion blur, things that we're not going to be talking about today. We have GI enabled. We'll be diving into GI in detail. And then we have these combined depths. And these are the ray bounces for these individual ray types. So depending on the things that you have or the rays inside of your scene, you will need to adjust these accordingly. And then we have hardware ray tracing, which I'm actually going to disable straight away. So what I want to do in my global illumination, so don't worry about this for now, I'm going to change this to brute force. This is only to give us a base idea of a nice looking render, because brute force is the slowest, but it's the most stable and it's the most accurate. And so what we want to do is really, we can only go so far with the basic mode. So if we want to start diving into these settings and diving into optimization, we need to come to our advanced tab. And this opens up all of the detailed or the advanced settings that are hidden in the basic tab. So first things first, and the place that we're going to begin to start to optimize our scene is going to be the sampling. So unified sampling. And by default, we have automatic sampling switched on. And this is an algorithm that works really well. Again, if you are not even new, so this is something I use quite often. I use automatic sampling, and then it sort of does all the hard work for us. And it is quite well optimized, but it can only go and it can only take us so far. If we want to really look at optimizing our scene and really kind of diving into saving some render time, we really want to be looking at manual sampling. So in order to enable manual sampling, we just need to uncheck this box. And then what you'll notice is it then opens up some other settings. So what's nice about Redshift is it hides the things we don't need when we don't need them. So with automatic on, we're not worried about anything else, so it hides it. But with manual on, we get access to these, and then we also get access to, in our lights, under the details tabs, this is an individual light I'm now on, we have, so let me just make sure you can see this because I know that my little face might be in the way. So now what we have is we also then have access to our individual light samples. So again, if I switch that on, it hides them, switch it off, it shows them. So what we can do is we can control each individual light if we want to, but really we don't necessarily have to actually go that deep. We can use our local samples to control everything as a whole. So to talk a little bit about unified sampling and then what we have access to here, if I was going to start speeding up this render, and just to kind of talk about that, actually, I did a few test renders at the beginning. So this top one here was a medium quality render. So in Basic, we have a medium quality brute force render. And it rendered in 7 minutes, 40 seconds. And it doesn't look too bad. Like the quality is fine for me. And the idea behind today's stream is optimizing your render settings for faster renders. We're not looking at making the most beautiful render in the entire world. We're not going photorealism. We're looking more optimization. I then did a low quality render, which if we take a look at this, if I sort of like come in and compare, hopefully you can all see this on the stream, that is, it's pretty low quality. Like we have a lot of noise, we have a lot of grain going on, and it doesn't really look very nice. But the thing is, it rendered in 1 minute and 10 seconds. So you would say that's a pretty good time when it comes to rendering. And so the aim here is we want to match this quality with this time. And of course, that is not always going to be possible, but we can look at some of the things that we can start to do to fix that. Let me just have a quick look through the questions. So Techno was wondering, did I disable hardware ray tracing because I'm using a Mac? No. So we will talk about this later on, but because not everyone has access to hardware ray tracing, I'm just going to switch that off for now, just so it doesn't take advantage of it. But I'm on an M3, and so I have access to that. Pavel was wondering, do I use non-automated or non-automatic sampling in my projects? It depends. It depends how much time I have, or one, how much time I have when it comes to creating a scene, or two, how much time I have when it comes to rendering. So if it's a render that's taking me a lot of time, then yes, I will dive into manual sampling. So let me have a quick look. Right, cool. Let's get into it. Let's get into some of the settings. So let's talk about unified sampling. So a few things that are important here is the samples min and max. So these are the minimum and the maximum samples or rays that are going to be fired per pixel. And then the threshold, which is the adaptive error threshold, that controls the sensitivity of the algorithm. So it controls how aggressively it's going to go from the minimum samples to the maximum samples. So if we have a low threshold, it will be more aggressive. So it will fire more until it hits the max. If we have a higher threshold, it will be less aggressive and less sensitive. And so a good place to start, really, and sort of when it comes to minimum samples, is 16 tends to cover majority of cases, especially when it comes to working with I say the new standard material. It's not really new anymore, but the new standard material, certain things will require a minimum of 16 samples. And then a good starting place for our max samples is 128. And the important thing here, when it comes to working with any kind of samples or any kind of rays, we want to work in exponential values. And that's because what Redshift does is it fires out rays in 32 ray bundles. So we want to be going sort of like 32, 64, 128, etc., because of those bundles that get fired out. Then on our threshold, again, so this is how aggressively it's going to fire 16 up to 128 samples. Let's go to a threshold of 0.1. And so this is the same as if we were working with a low bucket quality. So we can see here it's automatically adjusted to low. And so this is what we have going on. We have controlled these samples. And what these relate to is these relate to our primary rays. So it is anti-aliasing, depth of field, motion blur. It is not local rays or secondary rays like lights, reflections, refractions. Those we'll control later on. And so one other thing to sort of mention here is if we're working with heavy depth of field and heavy motion blur, you will want to up your samples max to something quite a bit higher, maybe 512, maybe 1024, just to compensate for that. So this is a starting point. We've taken a look at these samples. And the next bit is to then look at our local samples. And so these are our secondary rays, which are our overrides. And so this is where you as an artist need to decide and understand what's in your scene. So if you are working with reflection, what we need to do is we need to enable reflection. We can drop that down, and then we can choose to either replace the samples globally, so for all of reflection in our scene, or we can scale them up, and we can scale them up using this multiplier. And this is where it takes into consideration the individual samples. But again, I wouldn't necessarily worry about diving into an individual per light sample unless a particular light or ray type is giving you a lot of hassle in the scene. We can just stick to working with the global overrides. So I have some reflection in my scene. So we can see we have reflection down on this floor in here. And so a good starting point for this is 512 samples. I also have refraction in my scene because I've got that glass window. And again, I'm going to set this to 512 samples. So don't use what you don't need. And so in my scene, I don't have any AO, I can't see any specific lights, I don't have any volumetrics, and I don't have subsurface scattering. If you do, you will need to enable these, and you will need to either replace them or scale them up. So again, this is where you as the artist needs to be aware of what's going on in your scene. So this is a starting point. But there is one other local sample, and that is our brute force rays. And those can be found inside of our global illumination. So these are our GI rays. And so in this scene here, because we have quite a bit of GI going on, we will need to up our rays as well to maybe something like 512. And so at this point, what I'm going to do, I'm going to kick off a quick render, and then we're just going to go back through what we've just looked at. So again, this is what I'm saying. I want to be able to do these things live. So let me just kick off this render, and it's just going to have a little think about it, and we can kind of go back into what we were doing. Okay, so far what we've looked at is we've enabled or effectively disabled automatic sampling. So we're now doing manual sampling. We've defined our unified samples. So this is the minimum and maximum rays being fired per pixel. And then the adaptive error threshold is how aggressively it's going to keep firing until it hits the max. We then looked at our local samples, which are then our overrides. So our things that relate to our reflections or refractions, or our lights and our materials in our scene. We also then dove into our next lot of local samples, which is our brute force rays. So we'll talk about global illumination in a little bit, but for now we're just talking about all these sampling rays. And what we can see how our scene then looks inside of here. Okay, so let's take a little look. Have a look in here. So we can see we've got some noise and grain. And if we compare it to the original, which is the quality we kind of want to match, we can agree it doesn't look very good. However, we've got a great render time. We cut the render time down to 1 minute and 6 seconds, but we're losing too much of that quality. So now it's about tweaking these things. So we're not even worried about GI yet, not even worried about our globals or our trace steps. We're just worried about sorting out our samples first. And so taking a look at this, we can see we have noise in and around these areas, which is most likely going to be our GI rays. We can also see in the reflection, we're getting a lot of noise. And then also in our glass, we're getting some noise as well. So what I would then do is I would then look at maybe my reflection and refraction and GI need to be boosted. We need to increase the number of samples to help counteract that additional noise we have. And then I also want to adjust my unified sampling. And so let's go to 512. And then because we now have a larger max, we might then want to adjust the threshold value because we want Redshift to more aggressively, so the pixels that need more samples, we want it to be giving them more and more and more up until 512. And so in order to make it more sensitive and to give those pixels more rays, we need to reduce that threshold value. So we've now gone 0.01, which happens to be the medium bucket quality preset. So now what we've done is we've upped those values. And so what we can do is we can then kick off another render. And then we can see now what this looks like. And so whilst that is doing that, let me just take a little look at some questions. So someone was wondering about the video quality. It is HD, so 1080. So apologies if it is a little bit blurry for you. Unfortunately, there's not anything I can do about that. I've set my screen res to HD as well. Yeah, cool. Let me just have a quick look. What is considered? So this is a very subjective question. What's considered a fine render time on average? This is down to what you think, really, and it also depends on whether you're doing a still or an animation. If you are doing a still and it takes 5 minutes, maybe that's not the end of the world. But if you were doing a, 300 frame animation and each frame is taking 5 minutes, then that equates to a high amount of time. So again, it's really how much time you have to then spend on rendering, or whether you have a client deadline that's coming up. So that is very subjective. So we have a question from Halal about render settings for printing. If this is regarding 3D printing, this is not a topic that I am very familiar with. However, March's Demystifying series is covering everything to do with 3D printing. So hopefully your question should be suitable for then. Okay, so we can see this is taking a little bit longer, but if we just take a look, we've fixed a lot of that grain and that noise that we'd sort of created in here. But as we can see, it's now taking a little bit longer to render. So this is when we can then think of the next step of optimizing. So we've optimized our samples and we've already got what looks like a okay looking render. So it looks very similar to that original that took 7 minutes, 40 seconds, but it's now going to be taking about 3 minutes something. But again, we can still fix that problem. Also, a really quick thing before we move on, while it's just finishing off, is if you find there are fireflies in your scene that you can't get rid of, you can reduce the filter size and it will resolve some of those fireflies issues for you. Okay, right. Global illumination. Let's talk a little bit about that. So we have a primary GI engine, which are going to be for our primary rays. And then we have a secondary GI engine, which are going to then control those secondary rays, those local samples, those local overrides. By default, this is set to your primary GI is set to brute force. This is the most accurate and the most stable. I would recommend and suggest leaving this as brute force. The only time really you could use Irradiance cache is if you're using or creating ArcViz stills. But really, brute force is going to be the best way to go for a primary engine. We then have our secondary engine, which all the tests so far we've been doing have been brute force, brute force. Is the most stable, it's the most accurate, but it also is the slowest. And that's because brute force, what it does is it fires a ray to every single pixel. This is why it's more accurate, but it's why it's slower. So Irradiance point cloud. So this is a faster method. And the reason it's a faster method is the way it works is it fires a ray based on the screen radius. So far, every 16 pixels in a radius, a point gets fired. These then get interpolated and blended between. So this is why it's faster, because it's sort of cheating and biasing the GI to save time. The downside to Irradiance point cloud is because of this interpolation and because of this method, when it comes to animating, we can get some flickering. But what we can do is if we do work with this method, because it is going to be faster and we are working with animation, we could increase the retrace threshold to maybe a value of 2 or 3, and it should help prevent that. But in this case, because we're working with an interior scene with a lot of GI, Irradiance point cloud will work very, very well to not only speed up our render, but also to kind of smooth out some of that GI noise as well, because of that blending and that interpolating that is happening. So all I've done is change the secondary engine to Irradiance point cloud, and then we're going to see how much time we then save. So previously, we've got down to a pretty similar looking render, but it's now 3 minutes and 36 seconds per frame. So there's still things that we can do here. So let's just see how long this takes. So what you'll notice now is we sort of get these white areas that we can see, and this is our Irradiance point cloud. These are the rays being fired out, and then it's interpolating in between those. Cool. So whilst that is going, let's have a quick look. So here we go. This is a good question. You were saying that the goal is optimizing and less about photorealistic renders. But if we still want a photorealistic render with better render time, can we use these tips? Yes. What I mean is my purpose today, right now, is not to get a photorealistic render. So my purpose is to show you the optimizing tips and tricks. By all means, yes, absolutely. If you have created a photoreal render by controlling your lighting, controlling your materials, and controlling your render settings, then you can definitely still apply these tips to get back to that same quality render, but hopefully cut the render time. And also, quick disclaimer, a lot of this is scene dependent. So even though I'm saving a substantial percentage of time here, it is because of the scene that I'm working on. If you're working on a different scene, you might find a larger time saved or a smaller time saved. It is all relative to the settings and the attributes of your scene. But hopefully understanding how these techniques in this workflow works will allow you to speed up your renders. And that is the end goal for me today. Okay, so here we go. We have now got a 1 minute 48 render, which looks near on identical to this 3 minute 36 one. If we just sort of like come in, we can see. Pretty identical. And all we've really done is gone into our sampling. So we've used manual sampling. And now we've just taken a look at our global illumination. And instead of using that brute force method, which is going to be more accurate and more stable, but is going to be slower, we've looked at how we can use Irradiance point cloud, which then, as we see, fires less rays and then interpolates in between. The next step, actually, before we move on, I do want to talk about something really quickly on here. Some cases will require brute force. And this is a big thing when it comes to compositing. So if you're working with light passes, or if you're working with certain AOVs, in order to match the look of your render in compositing or in post, you might then need brute force. And so in some cases, dependent on if you're decompositing, you might need to be working with brute force, unfortunately, in that way. But we can still optimize through sampling and globals. So with this done, we can then take a look at our globals, which are our trace steps, and those are the individual ray bounces for these individual ray types. So we have a combined setting, which is a combination of our reflection, refraction, and volume. And then we have a transparency setting. And so the key thing about this is, again, it's down to you as the artist to see what's in your scene. Do we have a lot of reflection? Do we have a lot of refraction? Do we have volumetrics? And the key here is not to go too far by increasing them, because they can very much increase your render times. We want to almost use the bare minimum that gives us the same quality render. And so in this case, I'm actually going to reduce my reflection and my refraction to 3, because even despite having that, we can probably get away with having 3 bounces. Again, scene dependent. And then I have no volumetrics, so I'm just going to disable that. And then this is where we can see our hardware ray tracing. And so because I'm on an M3, I have access to this. But what I might do, I'm going to kick off this render first of all. I'm not even going to add hardware ray tracing yet. But just to talk a little bit about it, it requires newer GPUs that have, RT cores, so the RTX cards or the M3 chips. And what it does is it'll accelerate things for us by speeding up the rays getting fired. And so this should save some time. It won't necessarily, you won't see too much of an impact if you have quick renders anyway. So if you're working with 20, 30, 40-second renders, you won't really see much of a difference. And that's because it takes a little bit of like ramp up time to begin, which is sort of like 5 to 10 seconds, will be added on anyway, just from using this. But what it is great for is if you're instancing objects, so you've got a hill or a mountain with loads of grass, you're instancing the grass, you will find massive differences by using hardware ray tracing. Cool. So that shouldn't take too long. And then what I'll do another render just with that on so you can see, but I don't think you'll make too much of a difference because we're already getting a pretty good render time right now. And so this is the difference between adjusting our trace depths. So with the trace depths, if you are finding you're getting a lot of noise and grain, that is probably more likely to do with your samples. So remember to come into your sampling, and this is where we want to adjust this. So what I might do, I think in my glass, I'm still getting a little bit of, here we go. Yeah, so I'm still getting a little bit of noise. So hopefully we can see that is the original and that is the new one. So I'm still getting some noise. And so for this is where I would up my samples. My maths isn't working, 2048. So to get rid of this, I'm increasing this local refraction sample. And then let's just for fun, let's enable hardware ray tracing. Again, because I'm on an M3, I have access to that, but the M1s and the M2s or the previous Intel GPUs don't have access to that, unfortunately. And let's just kick off a new render. And then let's go through a couple more questions. So here we go. I've been having trouble with flickering during slow camera moves. Which settings would affect that? I tried brute force threshold 0.5. So you shouldn't really come across any flickering with brute force. Is it noise flickering or is it something else? If you could let me know, hopefully we can figure it out. So Mihai was wondering, what's the least I can do to avoid flickering while under this setting? So if you want to be working with brute force and IPC to reduce the flickering animation, increase that retrace threshold to a value of 2 or 3, and you should find that that actually prevents some of that flickering. Okay. Right, from Cal. In a scene with a decent amount of reflections and refractions, what basic optimizations would you recommend? Okay, so I would still go with this method. Of course, what you can do, maybe a good starting point is render out a frame with basic and have a look at like the low and the medium, just to get a comparison of maybe time versus quality. That's what I do sometimes. That's what I did here. So that's how I got these first two. I had like a quality render that I was happy with, but it took 7 minutes 40. I had a low one that I wasn't happy with, but it had a good render time. That is a good place to begin to get an idea of times. If you are then not happy with those times, that's when you want to come in and you want to be doing this workflow that we're looking at. Sampling, manual sampling, so unified samples, which we saw was here. So my threshold, my samples, min and max. You then want to go into your overrides. So if you've got a lot of reflection and refraction, these are the things you want to be overriding and adjusting. If you don't have these things, don't worry about them. And then you want to come into your GI and again, increase your raise. That is sort of the workflow that you would perhaps want to do if you want to speed up your render time. But again, you can always try those bucket quality presets and see how that works. So Ricardo is wondering, combined depth, the advantages. Well, so what combined depth is, it is just the combined depth value of these. And so if you increase your reflection and your refraction quite a lot, the combined bounces are going to be capped by that combined value. So make sure if you are increasing these trace depths and these bounces, you will also want to increase the combined as well. Otherwise, you'll just be capping it out. So does low light cause more GI sampling? So Yes, when it comes to working with low light scenes, your GI settings can be quite integral because those are so the rays, so the brute force rays, what these are going to do, that is going to fire samples in your areas where you get GI. So, for example, this scene, we can see all around here, this is our GI bouncing around and our light bouncing around. So, your rays are going to fire more samples and it's going to clean that up when it comes to noise. The trace depth value, so again, so we've looked at these trace depths, these individual ray bounces. We also have the trace depth in our brute force. These are the amount of GI and secondary bounces you're going to get. The more trace depths or the more GI bounces, the brighter your scene is going to be. That's the way that's going to work. Okay, so what have we got so far? We've got a 1 minute 29 second render, which looks pretty much identical to that original. So this is where we've been able to get to. And so what we've done, sampling, GI, or unified sampling, local sampling, GI, and then we've looked at trace depths, which are our bounces. And the final thing, we also enabled our hardware ray tracing. So we got a couple of seconds shaved off there as well, but not everyone has access to that. And then an extra little thing that we want to talk about is the bucket size. And so this is quite an important thing. And so when we do a render, you'll notice that it comes up with squares. These are our buckets. The size of our bucket is controlled by this value here. And it is literally just the size of the tile. So by default is 128 by 128 pixels. And the reason that's the default is because it's the safest for all GPUs and hardware types. So that's why it's set as the default. But what we can do is, again, dependent on your GPU and how much performance you have on your hardware, you can actually increase the bucket size and render using larger buckets. This in turn can result in faster render times. But what it will do is it's going to consume more of your GPU power. So the higher the RAM you have or the memory, the higher you can safely increase the bucket size. And so what you can even see, I hope you can see this, is I even get a warning saying your GPU has a lot of VRAM. We recommend increasing the bucket size. And so it's actually telling me that I have the capacity to increase the bucket size. But again, be careful when you are adjusting this setting because it is GPU dependent and scene dependent. Certain things won't work with a 512 bucket size. For example, Cryptomatte AOVs. And that's because they use something called a deep render output. And so it consumes way more RAM, way more memory. And so what it would do is if I put this on 512, it will automatically push it back to 256, or it might just crash Redshift, which is what none of us want. And so the more complex your scene with more intricate and small details, you will see that this has less of an effect. So let's just go to let's do 512 just for the sake of it. But I think we'll find not too much of an increase, if at all, because again, it's not the most sort of complex or intricate scene. And we've already got a render time of 1 minute 29. So sort of while that is kicking off, and again, I've not got any AOVs on here. So let's have a quick look. So from Bam, one more question. You can have as many questions as you like. I always get confused regarding primary GI engine and secondary GI engine. Does it stand primary for depth, anti-aliasing, and motion blur, and secondary? Yes, that's pretty much how it works. Yeah. So the primary is going to be the first rays that are fired out, and these are going to be brute force, it hits every pixel, and that is going to be, yes, depth of field, motion blur, anti-aliasing, and then so that your unified sampling. And then your local sampling, or secondary, is then going to be your reflection and your refraction and things like that. Cool. Okay, so let's have a quick look. So, okay, it saved us a couple of seconds, so not too bad. But remember, this is all relative. So this is relative to not only the scene that you're on, but also to of the time it takes to render each frame. So here you're probably thinking, oh, it saved you 9 seconds. But if we worked out the percentage of that, of like a 20-minute frame, that could actually be quite a high saving. Okay, so let's just let's recap a little bit. God, the time goes so quickly. So let's recap a little bit. So when we started out, we took a look at creating a medium quality render. So what we did, we had a medium quality render with automatic sampling with a brute force GI. And what that gave me is it gave me a render that I was relatively happy with the quality. So that is potentially your starting point, especially when you're first getting used to optimization and getting used to understanding the things that you need to control and adjust to speed up your render times. It's always great to have a base. And that took 7 minutes and 40 seconds. I then did a low quality render, again, brute force. And we could see it took 1 minute and 10 seconds, but the quality was not good. And so then the goal for me on this live stream was to try and get as close to this render time as possible, whilst then matching or getting as close to this quality as possible. And so through a series of different settings, which involved disabling automatic sampling. So we opened up manual sampling, which then opens up our samples min and max. So remember, this is the minimum number of samples that are being fired per pixel, and then the maximum number that are being fired. 16 is a great place to start. And that's sort of the minimum that you would want to stick to because it should cover most cases. We've then got our maximum samples set to 512, which in our case worked well. If you find you've got heavy motion blur, heavy depth of field, increase that to 1028. We then have the adaptive error threshold, which is the setting that controls the sensitivity or the aggression that Redshift will fire those rays out per pixel up to the maximum. So if you find you're still getting a little bit of noise, decrease that threshold to a lower value. We're on 0.01, which was the same as the medium bucket quality preset. We then came down to our local samples, which is everything like our reflections, refractions, ambient occlusion, SSS. We then look at what's in our scene. So for me, I've got reflection, I've got refraction. So I've enabled them and I've replaced the samples globally. So all of the samples for reflection in my scene are now being set to 1024. Again, 512, good place to start, and then you work your way up. We then looked at our final local sample, which was our brute force rays. This controls our GI, so the noise and everything that occurs in our GI. Again, we went with 1024 because it's an interior scene, so we needed to boost that up a little bit to compensate for any noise. We then looked at global illumination. So most stable and most accurate, but slowest, brute force. But what we did is we used Irradiance point cloud as our secondary engine. And so what this does is it fires a ray in the screen radius of 16, so fires a ray, and then it interpolates and blends between them. Therefore, it's faster because it's kind of cheating and biasing. And then therefore we can get faster render times. When you're working with animation and you want to go with this method, have a play with the retrace threshold, bring that up to maybe 2 or 3 to prevent flickering. We then looked at our globals, which are our trace steps. So these are the bounces per individual ray. Again, the key thing here for optimizing is don't use what you don't need. Try and go as low as possible and then work your way up. So remember, if it's things like noise, go to the samples. If it's things like this, then we want to have a look at the trace steps. Combined is the combined value of them. If you don't have these settings in your scene or the ray types, for example, I don't have volumetrics, don't use them. it will just add render time. If you have access to hardware ray tracing, we can enable that. And then don't forget, you also have your trace steps for your brute force rays in here, which are your GI rays. We then looked at the bucket quality. So again, be careful with this because it again depends on your hardware and your GPU, and also depends on the AOVs that you have in your scene. 128 is the safest default, but going up to 256, if you have the capacity, should also add and save some of your render times as well. And so what we were able to do, we were able to come all the way down to then create this render, which, as we can see, is pretty much identical to that first one, but we've got a render time of 1 minute 20. So we've been able to save a lot of our render time here. Cool. Here's a good question. Would you use denoising for this scene if you were animating it? I personally avoid denoising. I would prefer to fix any kind of grain or issues by coming into my sampling settings. But I mean, if you're 95% close, then yes, by all means, you could take a look at denoising your scene as well. I maybe wouldn't really do it for animation though, because you might get a different result. You might get a different denoising result in maybe the GI, and so it could cause not necessarily flickering, but it could cause some slight differences frame to frame. So yeah, perhaps not for animation. So random noise, yes. Let me remind myself of where that is. Oh, someone might need to tell me or remind me where random noise is. There we go. Random noise pattern. Okay, yeah. So random noise pattern, what it does is pretty much in every frame or in every render you do, there's going to be a little bit of noise or some kind of noise somewhere. When it comes to then doing an animation, having a random noise pattern per frame then will look better, because if you didn't have a random noise pattern and it kept the noise, the little bit of noise that it had, it would look like there are little bits stuck in your animation. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, having random noise pattern enabled will prevent seeing what will look like little marks in here. I don't want to ignore this question, but I unfortunately don't know. I'm not very knowledgeable when it comes to color management and OCIO. I apologize. I would definitely recommend contacting the training team, because we have Dr. Sassy, who is very, very knowledgeable. So maybe training@maxon.net. He should be able to help you out. Cool. Yeah. So I've noticed whenever I use 512 bucket, it takes longer than 256. Yep, that can be the case if you have more complex details in your scene. It will then take longer to then render with a 512 bucket size versus a 256. So again, a lot of this stuff that we talked about is GPU dependent, and it's also scene dependent. Did I use individual light sampling because your light sampling is set off? No, I didn't. So you can't actually see any lights in my scene. So all the lighting inside of here is being controlled by GI. So that's a really good question. So yeah, the lighting that I can see in my interior shot is being controlled by the GI. So I didn't need to add any light samples. I just used my GI rays for my sampling for that. But yes, if this was nighttime and I had lights on, let's say I had these lights on, or I had like a lamp on, then yes, I would need to add and include my light local samples here. Just going through some final questions. So, oh, perfect. Cool. So Blood Rapture said, color management has not affected render times for me. Perfect. Cool. Well, thank you for that answer. That answers that question for you. And we've had Yeah, some other things from Zadie saying about denoising for animation is best done temporarily, and random noise pattern is better for denoising in post. I'll throw that up because I think that's a really great piece of advice. So yeah, thank you. Also, thank you to everyone, not only who asked questions, but those of you who then do these great bits of advice. Like I love learning from you all, and I'm sure everyone else benefits from all this stuff as well. So really quickly, just to sort of round up, we sort of hit the hour. My plan wasn't to go too far past that. Remember, all of this stuff that we talked about and this optimization workflow is scene dependent. Hopefully, this gives you the knowledge and the understanding of how you can begin to optimize and the optimization workflow. So again, we looked at manual sampling, and we looked at our min and max samples and our threshold, which is the sensitivity. We looked at our local overrides, and we looked at our global illumination, and then our trace steps. That is the order or the workflow that you might want to incorporate and start to look at to begin optimizing your scenes. Hopefully it works to improve your scenes. In some cases it might not. It is not a given. Unfortunately, that is the case when it comes to rendering. It is scene dependent. But hopefully you can at least save some of your time and start to begin to get some faster renders. The Redshift documentation is actually a extremely useful resource. And so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to link to that as well. So let me come into here. So this is a useful resource. So take a look at that. Hopefully you can maybe combine that with the stuff that I've talked about today. Again, you have access to this project file. I'll link it in the description later on. So anyone watching the recording, then it should be in there for you. But if not, it's on my Instagram under my project files. I'm just at itwaselly. I think I've got my little thing here just in case. Yeah, I hope it was useful. Like, I know, as I said, it was a bit more of a technical explanation and a technical workflow as opposed to a project breakdown, but a lot of you have been asking about how you can optimize render settings and how we can speed up renders. So I thought I would take advantage of this live stream and talk about things like that. Okay, cool. There's a couple more questions, so I'm gonna just wrap up by answering those. So Bam was saying, can you talk about the filter in unified sampling? Of course I can. So the filter size, this can be used if you come across things like fireflies. So if you find like maybe some lights are causing some fireflies or some issues, what we can do is we can reduce that filter size, and then it should work to reduce and remove some of those. And so the max subsample intensity, this is your secondary rays or anything. So sorry, no, this is your secondary rays, and this is anything GI related. So yeah, reduce that filter, and that should help with clamping fireflies. Let me just cut through really quickly. So also thank you for the thank yous. I'm really glad you all enjoyed it. Technical stuff, yes, it's definitely not my forte, but hopefully it was useful. As always, if you ever have any questions for me, feel free to either like comment on the YouTube recording. So yes, this has been recorded and it gets uploaded onto the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. Have any questions for me, feel free to comment on YouTube. You can always email Maxon, or please feel free to DM me on Instagram. I've been sharing a little bit more lately on there. So let me just sort of throw this on. So here we go. This is my Instagram. Feel free to, send me a message on there if you have any questions. I've got all my project files on here, so you can download all my project files. And then I've also been talking a lot more about Redshift render settings. So you can come through and you can dive into some more information about these. But thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone who watched live, who answered questions, who asked questions, and also to those of you that you added some tips and tricks of your own. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. Have lovely weekends, and I will catch you on another stream soon. Goodbye, everyone.